A millionaire thought he was being a good father by sending money, until a desperate phone call from his daughter shattered everything. What he uncovered was a chilling story of control, silence, and survival. But from the ruins, a movement was born, one that turned pain into purpose and darkness into light. You won't believe how far this family came and how many lives they changed along the way. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. I used to believe my life was perfectly constructed, every meeting scheduled, every account reconciled, every outcome anticipated. As CEO of one of the most aggressive private equity firms in New York, I thrived on control. My days began before dawn with black coffee and quarterly projections, and they ended long after the market closed with backlit spreadsheets and the hum of city lights beyond my penthouse office windows. I thought that was what being a good man looked like. Wealthy, reliable, generous in the ways that mattered. After all, I'd made sure my ex-wife Marianne and our daughter Lily were set for life. The divorce 3 years ago had been civilized, efficient, free of shouting matches or courtroom drama. I paid more than the court required, gave her the apartment in Boston, kept our interactions professional. In my mind, I had done everything right. So when my phone buzzed with an unknown number during a Monday strategy meeting, I should have ignored it. But something, some quiet instinct or divine whisper, told me to answer. "Excuse me, I need to step out," I said to the boardroom, barely waiting for acknowledgement before stepping into the hall. I thumbed the green icon, pressing the phone to my ear. I expected a telemarketer or misdial. What I heard instead froze me to the marble floor. "Daddy?" The voice was so soft, so fragile, I nearly missed it. "Lily?" My heart immediately kicked into overdrive. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" There was a pause, filled with the sound of sniffling and shallow breathing. "Mommy fell, in the kitchen. She's not waking up." I leaned against the wall, my mind struggling to reconcile the polished, controlled world around me with what I was hearing. "She fainted?" I asked, already fishing for my keys and moving toward the elevator. "Did you call anyone?" I didn't know how," Lily whispered. "I was scared. I used Mommy's old phone, the one she told me to hide." "Where are you right now?" "In my room, under the bed. Mommy said to hide if Marcus comes back." The air left my lungs. "Marcus? Who's Marcus?" But before she could answer, the line went dead. I stood there, phone to my ear, the quiet buzz of the disconnected call ringing louder than any boardroom bell ever had. My hands trembled. In less than 60 seconds, the entire narrative I'd built around my responsible fatherhood collapsed like glass beneath my feet. I called emergency services immediately, rattling off Marianne's address in a voice hoarse with disbelief. I barely remembered grabbing my coat or explaining to my assistant that I had a family emergency. I just remembered getting into the back of my car and yelling at my driver to head to the airport. The plane ride to Boston was turbulent. Not because of weather, but because my mind was at war with itself. I replayed every transaction, every monthly wire transfer I'd sent like clockwork. I had the receipts. The numbers were sound. So how was my daughter hiding under her bed because they hadn't eaten? As we lifted into the sky, the morning sun glared off the wings of the jet like an accusation. That same sun had shone through my corner office window just 2 hours earlier, reflecting off glass walls and polished metal. But now it seemed cruel, exposing all the things I hadn't seen, hadn't wanted to see. By the time I landed, EMS had already transported Marianne to Massachusetts General. A social worker was staying with Lily. I drove straight to the apartment. The building was unrecognizable. 3 years ago, I had picked it out myself, top floor, good security, concierge services. It was supposed to be safe. But the moment I stepped inside, reality hit me like a cold gust of wind. The wallpaper was peeling, the lights flickered overhead, the smell of damp carpet and something sour lingered in the air. The elevator was out of order, so I ran up 6 flights of stairs, my legs burning, my mind racing faster. Outside the door, a woman with tired eyes met me. "Mr. Walsh," she asked, offering a badge. "Mrs. Martinez, Child Protective Services." "I want to see my daughter," I said, breathless. "She's inside. She's been through a lot." She stepped aside and I walked into what used to be a home. The couch was ripped. The windows were covered with blankets instead of curtains. A sink full of unwashed dishes sat under a flickering light. And then I heard it. "Daddy?" Lily's voice small and shaking. She ran from the hallway and threw herself into my arms. I lifted her, stunned by how light she was. Her clothes were threadbare. Her hair smelled unwashed. But her eyes held a fear I had never seen before. Not in a child, not in my child. "I've got you," I whispered, trying to steady my voice. "Daddy's here now." She clung to me, and in that moment, the man who ran billion-dollar acquisitions and crushed Wall Street doubters felt completely undone. Nothing in my life, no hostile takeover, no legal battle, had ever felt as devastating as holding that trembling little girl. Mrs. Martinez watched quietly, giving us space. I finally asked the question that had been burning through my throat. "How did this happen? I send money, every month, on time, more than enough." Her voice was careful. "We're still investigating, Mr. Walsh, but from what your daughter has shared, it appears your ex-wife's partner, Marcus, was exerting significant financial control, manipulation, possibly worse." Lily looked up at me, eyes wide. "He said we didn't deserve nice things." My blood turned to ice. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a budgeting issue. This was abuse. Not the kind that left bruises, but the kind that starved people slowly, silently. The kind that hid in bank statements and silence. The kind I never saw coming because I was too busy being a provider instead of being present. I looked down at Lily, her cheek pressed against my shoulder. "I'm taking her," I said. Mrs. Martinez nodded. "We were hoping you'd say that." And just like that, the first illusion fell. I thought I had done my part, but I hadn't even scratched the surface of what it meant to be a father. By the time I reached Marianne's apartment building again, this time with Lily safely sleeping in the backseat of the town car I'd rented for the week, the early dusk was settling in. The city lights of Boston were just beginning to blink on, casting a cold amber glow on everything. I parked on the curb, stared up at the weathered facade, and felt a sharp pang of guilt twist in my chest. I had chosen this building myself, years ago. It had once been pristine, secure, modern, with clean white stone and mirrored windows. Now, the same glass reflected broken blinds and boarded balconies. I carried Lily inside, her head resting against my shoulder. She'd barely spoken since I picked her up from CPS. Her only words had been a whispered request. "Can I take Bunny?" I nodded as she clutched a threadbare stuffed rabbit in one hand, its ears frayed from years of nighttime tears. She hadn't even asked about her mother. I wasn't sure if she was too afraid, or if she somehow already understood more than I did. The hallway still smelled of mildew and old cooking grease. A busted overhead light flickered spasmodically like a dying star. On the 6th floor, the elevator was still out. I carried Lily up each flight slowly, her weight alarmingly light in my arms. Inside the apartment, I finally looked around in full. This wasn't just neglect, it was abandonment. Bit by bit, like erosion. The coffee table was gone. The curtains were replaced with duct-taped sheets. A single cracked plate sat in the sink. The refrigerator buzzed loudly but emitted no cold air. I opened it. Inside was a half jar of mustard, an expired yogurt, and a bottle of tap water. My fists clenched. This was where my daughter had been living. In the middle of this quiet devastation, Mrs. Martinez from CPS sat waiting. She stood when we entered, nodding solemnly. "I stayed behind in case you had questions," she said gently, eyeing Lily asleep in my arms. She was very brave today. I lowered Lily onto the only usable piece of furniture left, a sagging couch whose cushions had lost all structure. She curled into it, clutching Bunny tight. I wrapped my coat over her, then turned back to Mrs. Martinez. "Tell me everything." She gestured for me to sit. "I didn't. Your ex-wife, Marianne, she was admitted to Massachusetts General earlier today. EMTs found her collapse from dehydration and malnutrition." "She was." Martinez paused, choosing her words carefully. "She was in worse shape than we expected." My throat tightened. "How bad?" "Stable, for now. But it wasn't just physical." She gave me a long look. "It's clear she's been under severe emotional and psychological distress for a prolonged period." I shook my head. "I don't understand. I've been sending her money. Monthly, without fail." "I've reviewed the court filings," she said. "Yes, you've gone above and beyond your obligations. But financial abuse doesn't always look like someone withholding funds. Sometimes it's someone else controlling the access." "Marcus," I said quietly. She nodded. We believe Marcus had significant control over your ex-wife's bank accounts. Your daughter mentioned that he often said they didn't deserve nice things, and that he accused Marianne of being irresponsible with money. I felt the cold of rage settle beneath my skin. Did he live here? For the last 8 months, yes, off and on. According to Lily, he would come and go, sometimes for days, sometimes he'd stay for a week straight. She said he didn't like her talking to you, that he told her not to say anything during your Sunday calls or he'd take her mom's phone. I sat down slowly, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. 8 months. 8 months of this. Slow suffocation, and I hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it in Marianne's voice. Hadn't noticed the subtle withdrawal of Lily's bright spirit over our Sunday chats. I thought I was respecting boundaries, letting Marianne have space, letting her rebuild. Instead, I left her vulnerable. She told Lily not to open the door if anyone came, Mrs. Martinez continued. That's why she hid under the bed. That instinct may have saved her. I looked toward the couch where Lily stirred slightly and then sank deeper into sleep, her face hidden beneath my coat. What happens now? We'll be opening an investigation, she said. Your daughter's safety is our priority, and given the state of the home, as well as Marianne's condition, we're placing Lily in your temporary custody. Do you have somewhere safe to take her? I've already rented a furnished condo in Back Bay, I said without hesitation. I'll keep her close. I've arranged a professional caregiver to help during the day until Marianne recovers. She nodded with quiet approval. That's a good start. I hesitated. I need to see Marianne. She deserves to know Lily's safe. I agree, but you should be prepared. For what? Mrs. Martinez looked me square in the eyes. She may not be the woman you remember. When I arrived at the hospital an hour later, the halls were quiet except for the low hum of machines and distant intercom announcements. A nurse led me to her room. Outside, I paused. My reflection stared back at me in the small window of the hospital door. My tailored coat, silk tie, polished shoes. I looked like someone from another planet, someone who had never stepped into a room where pain lived. Inside, Marianne lay motionless. Her frame had withered. Her cheekbones jutted beneath pale skin. Her arms were wrapped in IV lines, hands curled in toward her chest. Her hair, once vibrant and wavy, hung limp against the pillow. She didn't see me at first. Then her eyes fluttered open. Greg? Her voice was barely audible. Is Lily? She's safe, I said immediately, stepping to her bedside. She's with me. Relief spread across her face, but it came with a quiet sob that shook her whole body. I tried to protect her. I know. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, she whispered. He said he'd help. He started by offering to pay a few bills. Then he said I was reckless, that I spent too much, that I was ruining Lily. Her fingers gripped the blanket like it might float away. I believed him, she choked. I let him into everything, my bank account, my schedule, even my prescriptions. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, a sensation unfamiliar, even alien. I should have known, I whispered. I should have been paying attention. You were being fair, she said. You gave me space, you respected the divorce. But I didn't respect myself. Not enough to say no when I needed to. We sat in silence for a long while. Her monitors beeped steadily in the background, the only proof that time was still moving forward. Finally, she looked at me again, eyes red and rimmed with exhaustion. Greg, promise me you'll protect her, no matter what happens to me. I took her hand, holding it gently, I swear. And in that moment, for the first time in years, we weren't ex-spouses or broken people. We were just parents, fragile, fallible, and trying at long last to get it right. The next morning, I returned to the hospital before sunrise. The city was still half asleep, the streets wet with dew, and the lights of Massachusetts General glowed like quiet sentinels in the fog. I walked the familiar hallway with 2 paper cups of black coffee, though I doubted Marianne could drink much of anything yet. Truth was, I needed to do something with my hands. Anything other than pace and imagine worst-case scenarios. Marianne was sitting upright when I arrived, propped up by a few pillows, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in days, there was something like clarity behind them. I wasn't sure you'd come back, she said softly. I wasn't sure you'd be awake, I replied, setting 1 coffee down on her bedside table. She gave me a fragile smile, tired but real. I didn't sleep much, the nurses keep checking vitals, and my mind won't stop racing. I know the feeling. We sat in a silence that wasn't exactly comfortable, but not cold either. Something lived in that stillness. Grief, maybe. Regret, but also understanding. "I don't know where to start," she said after a long pause. "Start with him," I said. "Marcus." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. It happened so gradually I didn't even realize how deep I was sinking. He was charming at first, attentive, said all the right things. He helped me feel seen. After the divorce, I was lonely, Greg. I wasn't used to being alone. I nodded slowly. "I understand." He offered to help with bills, said I needed to focus on Lily, on rebuilding my life, and not worry about money. And I believed him. I thought, this is what support looks like. Someone stepping in when you're vulnerable. "But that's not what it was," I said quietly. "No," she whispered. "He asked to be added to my bank account so he could organize things better. At first it was small, consolidating bills, canceling what he called luxuries. But then he started questioning my grocery lists, telling me Lily didn't need after-school art, that her clothes were just fine. Every decision had to go through him. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my jaw locking. "He started using your support money," she said. "Not for Lily, not for us, for himself. Gambling, I think, vacations I never saw. And when I questioned him, he'd get cold, scary even. Said I was ungrateful, that he was the only reason I wasn't drowning." She swallowed, then added in a broken whisper, "He was probably right." "No," I said, firmer than I intended. "No, Marianne, he made sure you felt that way. That's what abusers do. They don't just control the money, they control the narrative." She looked at me with eyes that were rimmed in red but dry now. "I was scared to tell you. I thought you'd think I was weak, that I'd failed as a mother." I leaned forward, my voice gentler. "You didn't fail. You tried to protect Lily the only way you knew how. You made sure she had a phone hidden, didn't you?" Marianne nodded slowly. "That saved her," I said. "It saved both of you." The room went quiet again. A nurse entered briefly to check vitals, smiled politely at me, and left without a word. When the door clicked shut behind her, Marianne let out a long, trembling breath. "There's more," she said. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it, but I had to. For her. For Lily. For all the years I'd spent checking boxes instead of checking in. "He started bringing home medication," she said. "Not from my doctor. Anxiety pills," he said, "to help me relax." I didn't ask questions. I was so tired. I wanted to believe he meant well. But I think he was drugging me. I froze. "I'd lose hours," she continued. "Wake up not remembering conversations. Lily would tell me I promised to cook, to play, but I couldn't recall anything. I thought I was losing my mind, and that terrified me more than anything. My heart clenched at the image of Lily, a child trying to care for her mother, watching her vanish in plain sight. The weight of that broke something in me. I had been a provider, yes, but I hadn't been present. I hadn't seen the signs, hadn't looked close enough. "He told me if I said anything," she whispered, "he'd make sure I lost custody. Said he had access to your emails, your bank statements, that he could twist things. He said the courts wouldn't believe me, that I'd look like a negligent mother." I stood up and began to pace, the coffee in my hand trembling. "We'll press charges. We'll build a case. I've already hired a forensic accountant, and I've got private investigators digging into his past." She blinked, surprised. "You're already doing all that?" "I started the moment I left here yesterday," I said. "This isn't just about justice, Marianne. This is about making sure no one else goes through this." Her lips quivered. "You really believe we can stop him?" "I know we can," I said, "and we'll do it together." She looked down at her hands, pale and thin against the blanket. "I'm so tired, Greg." I came back to her bedside, pulled a chair close. "Then rest. Let me carry this for a while. You've done more than enough." She leaned her head back against the pillow, eyes closing slowly. For the first time since I'd walked into her room, her face looked peaceful. Not healed, not whole, but at peace. And as she drifted off to sleep, I realized something I hadn't dared admit. I still cared for her. Not in the way I had when we were married. Not the sharp heat of romance, or the youthful ambitions that used to keep us awake at night. No, this was different. This was deeper. A kind of quiet, enduring love that never needed to be named. The kind that binds people together in dark times, that endures after mistakes, after pain. The kind you discover only when you're rebuilding a life you thought was already finished. I kissed her forehead gently. Sleep well, I murmured. And I meant it. Because the war was just beginning, and this time, I wouldn't fight it from a distance. By the end of that week, my condo in Back Bay had transformed into a kind of war room. What once served as a quiet, temporary living space now buzzed with activity. Documents spread across the dining table, phones ringing every hour. My laptop constantly running encrypted reports from the forensic accountant and private investigator I'd hired. Lily's drawings were taped on one end of the fridge, while bank records and legal printouts were pinned to the other side, with magnets shaped like animals. The strange contrast wasn't lost on me. My daughter's innocence coexisting alongside the dark unraveling of a predator's scheme. Each new discovery about Marcus made my blood run colder. His real name wasn't Marcus Langford, as he had claimed to Marianne. It was Derek Malone, and he had a pattern, a quiet, methodical trail of manipulation spanning nearly a decade. 3 different women in the past 5 years, all of them single mothers. All of them with access to money, inheritances, settlements, divorce arrangements. All of them isolated. None of them had pressed charges. Until now. I had Janet, my longtime executive assistant, flown in from New York for a few days to help me compile the findings. She was sharp, loyal, and knew how to work in silence, which was exactly what I needed. "He's good," she muttered, flipping through another set of printed bank statements. "He starts small, subtle shifts, a grocery bill here, a cash withdrawal there, never enough to trigger suspicion. But over time..." She turned the page and slid it toward me. I followed the columns of numbers. "He drained Marianne's account in less than 6 months, I said. Janet nodded, "and funneled a good portion into crypto wallets, shell corporations, and investment accounts tied to fake names. Some of the credit card purchases trace back to online pharmacies." "Medication," I muttered, my jaw tightening. Janet lowered her voice. "Dr. Chen confirmed they found high levels of benzodiazepines in Marianne's blood. Not prescribed by any licensed doctor. He was keeping her dependent, emotionally, financially, chemically." I pushed back from the table and stood, rubbing my hands down my face. There was no boardroom in the world that could have prepared me for this. The tactics I once admired in hostile takeovers, the cold strategy, the quiet pressure, the manipulation of optics, had all been used here. But this wasn't a corporate asset under siege. This was my family. He used my money to do it. The irony made me sick. "He took every dollar I sent her," I said, walking toward the window. The winter sun lit the Charles River in the distance, but the beauty felt hollow now. "And weaponized it." Janet hesitated. "Greg, you can't blame yourself." "I was blind, Janet. I thought writing a check meant I was doing my job. Because that's what we're taught to believe," she said. "That if you provide, you've fulfilled your role. That silence is success." I turned to face her. "Not anymore. We're going after him. Not just for Marianne and Lily, but for every woman he's done this to." She nodded and handed me a new folder. "You'll want to see this." The PI's report on Derek's previous victims. I skimmed the pages, photos of smiling women now hollowed by circumstance. Most of them had refused interviews, too ashamed, too broken. One of them, however, had spoken to the investigator, Jessica Lau, a former paralegal who had left her job after a nervous breakdown. She lived alone now, recovering slowly, quietly. And just like Marianne, she hadn't realized it was abuse until it was nearly too late. "Set up a meeting," I said. "I want to hear her story myself." Janet gave me a long look. "You're going all in." "I have to," I said. "This isn't just about justice anymore. It's about redemption." That evening, I took Lily for a walk along the river. She held my hand, bundled in a puffy purple coat and knit hat that nearly swallowed her face. We stopped for hot cocoa from a street vendor, and as we sat on a bench sipping from paper cups, she leaned her head against my arm. "Daddy," she said, her voice small, "are we going back to Mommy's house?" "Not right now," I replied gently. "We're going to stay here for a little while, just you and me." She nodded slowly, her eyes following the ducks along the water's edge. "It's quiet here. I like it." I watched her for a moment, then said, "Do you remember when you called me that day? When you said Mommy fainted?" She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I was scared." "I know, sweetheart, but you were so brave." She stared into her cup. "He used to say Mommy didn't know how to take care of us, that if I told anyone we'd be taken away. I didn't want to be taken away from Mommy." My chest ached. You're never going to be taken away. Not by anyone, I promise. She looked up at me. Even if I'm not always good? I set down my cup and pulled her into my arms. Being scared doesn't make you bad. Being confused doesn't make you wrong. What matters is that you told the truth, that you asked for help, and you did it just in time. She sniffled, then whispered, Mommy tried to be strong. I know, I said. She still is, and we're going to help her get better, together. As we walked back toward the condo, Lily's hand stayed in mine, warm and steady. That night, after she fell asleep, curled up next to her new storybook, I sat down at my laptop. I typed up a detailed summary of Derek Malone's actions, his methods, his financial traces, his manipulation tactics. I included everything we had discovered, citing examples, timestamps, transaction records. Then I sent it to 3 places. First, to the district attorney's office. Second, to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. And third, to every domestic abuse advocate and financial protection agency I could find across the Northeast. If I'd learned anything over the past week, it was that abusers thrive in silence, and I was done being silent. By midnight, I received my first response. A representative from a national domestic abuse prevention agency replied, thanking me for shedding light on a case that echoed hundreds of untold stories. They asked if I would consider working with them to develop educational material for financial abuse survivors. I stared at the email for a long moment. Then I clicked yes. I didn't fully understand yet what my role would be, or how far this path might go. But I knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd ever been told she was too expensive, too irresponsible, too difficult. Every child who'd ever watched their parents shrink under the weight of someone else's control. It was time to expose the pattern. And it was time to make sure Derek Malone never hurt another family again. 2 weeks after Marianne was admitted to the hospital, the formal investigation into Derek Malone's financial abuse was in full swing. My condo had become a hive of legal activity, attorneys, advocates, and analysts coming in and out, dropping files, asking questions, sharing updates. I'd moved a second desk into the guest room to give Janet a workspace, and the 2 of us now operated more like wartime strategists than a former CEO and his assistant. But this wasn't a company crisis. It was something far more personal. The stakes weren't about shareholders or quarterly profits. They were about dignity, safety, truth, and justice. We'd gathered enough evidence to file for criminal charges: fraud, identity theft, coercive control, and unlawful possession of prescription medication. I'd connected with the previous victims, Jessica Lau, Maria Ferguson, and Deborah Lynn, and convinced them to provide written statements. They were scared, hesitant, but they were tired of hiding, and they weren't alone anymore. Meanwhile, Marianne was recovering slowly. Her weight was returning, her color was brighter. The tremble in her voice had faded, replaced by a cautious steadiness. She was still fragile, but the light in her eyes was no longer just pain. It was fight. The first time she saw Lily again, it was in a sunlit courtyard outside the hospital. Marianne sat in a wheelchair wrapped in a thick cardigan, and Lily ran to her like a bird flying home. No words, just the sound of their embrace, the way Marianne buried her face in her daughter's hair and held on like she'd never let go again. I stood a few feet away, watching them. That moment burned into me like fire. And I knew, no matter what else happened, I was never letting this fall apart again. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with Lily, fast asleep in her room, and Marianne on a video call from the hospital. She looked tired, but she was sitting up straighter, her hair freshly washed, her tone measured. "We need to talk about custody," she said gently. I leaned forward. "You want her back with you?" "Eventually," she nodded. "But not right now. I'm not ready. Not completely." I exhaled, nodding in return. "I want us to do this differently," she added. "Not like before. Not with silence and assumptions. I want joint therapy, parenting support, something lasting." That was the moment I realized how much she'd grown, not just recovered, but truly risen. Marianne was no longer the woman trying to survive behind closed doors. She was building something new. And I was all in. The next day, I met with the DA. Our legal team had submitted the compiled report, and the district attorney had assigned the case to a prosecutor who specialized in financial coercion and domestic abuse. "You have a hell of a paper trail," she said, tapping the folder with her pen. This is the kind of case that sets precedent. Most financial abusers don't leave this kind of evidence, especially not when the money is technically theirs through relationship manipulation. But Malone got greedy, left digital fingerprints everywhere. "He needs to be stopped," I said, my voice calm but unshakable. "He will be," she replied, "but it's going to be a fight. He's already lawyered up, and he's not backing down." I expected that. The kind of man Derek was, he wouldn't go quietly. He'd spin a narrative, play the victim, blame the women, cast doubt on the evidence. He'd lie through his teeth and try to drown us in paperwork. But I wasn't afraid of him anymore. That night, I told Marianne about the DA meeting. She listened in silence, then nodded. "I want to testify," she said, "when the time comes." "You sure?" "I have to. If not for me, then for Lily, for the other women. For every mother too ashamed to speak because she thinks no one will believe her." I felt something shift in my chest. Pride. Respect. And maybe something deeper I hadn't quite named yet. In the meantime, I continued building what had started as an idea and was now becoming a movement. The Walsh Foundation for Financial Safety and Recovery. It began with a few calls. Nonprofits, community shelters, therapists, but soon momentum picked up. We outlined a 5-part initiative: legal advocacy, survivor housing assistance, financial literacy education, child trauma counseling, and emergency response grants. Lily, in her own way, became the quiet heart of it all. She didn't know about the legal battle or the system we were trying to change, but her resilience, the way she was slowly reclaiming her childhood, was the strongest argument for everything we were doing. She began drawing again. Bright colors, patterns. One evening, she showed me a picture of a house. "This is our new home," she said. I looked at the drawing. A small yellow house with sunlight pouring through its windows. A mom, a dad, and a little girl standing in front holding hands. No monsters in the windows. No shadows at the door. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice catching. She pointed to a figure on the far side of the picture. A man standing behind a tree. "That's him," she said. "But he can't come in anymore." Something about that image, her version of closure, of boundary, moved me more than any court document ever could. It was a reminder that healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in pictures, in quiet reassurances, in steady, sleepless nights when you hold your child and promise them that monsters don't get to win. A week later, I got the call. Malone had been arrested. Fraud, coercive control, unlawful possession of controlled substances, and multiple counts of financial exploitation. I stood in the hallway outside Marianne's room, phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding like a drum. When I stepped back inside, she looked up at me. "He's in custody," I said. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she reached for my hand. We sat like that for several minutes, the silence louder than any victory speech. Later, when I returned home, Lily was waiting for me on the couch in her pajamas. "Did you win?" she asked, sleepily. I knelt in front of her. "We started winning," I said, "and we're not going to stop." She nodded, then crawled into my arms and whispered, "Can we be a real family again someday?" I didn't hesitate. We already are. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Spring arrived in Boston quietly. The city thawed under long, golden afternoons and the hum of possibility. The snow had melted, the river flowed freely again, and cherry blossoms bloomed near the public garden, where Lily and I took walks almost every evening. But inside the Walsh Foundation's temporary headquarters, what had once been my second-floor condo, things were anything but quiet. What began as a desperate attempt to make things right for my daughter and ex-wife had become a full-scale operation. The foundation was no longer just an idea or a collection of files. It was now a living, breathing entity powered by advocates, survivors, lawyers, and community leaders who saw what we were trying to build and believed in it. We called it Project Lightkeeper. The name had been Lily's. She'd said it one night, out of nowhere, after I tucked her in and asked what she wanted to be when she grew up. "A lightkeeper," she whispered. "Someone who helps people see where the light is when everything's dark." I'd gone into the other room and cried for the first time in months. Now the name adorned our first public proposal. A trauma-informed, family-centered recovery system that addressed not only the financial exploitation of abuse victims, but also the invisible wounds that followed. The shame, the fear, the self-doubt. Caroline, Marianne, was finally home, and for the first time since her release, She felt like more than a patient. She was no longer surviving. She was participating. She had joined our advisory board, tentatively at first, quietly, but with time, her confidence returned. She started speaking out, first in small groups, then on local panels. She was clear-eyed, eloquent, and brutally honest, and the women who heard her felt seen, understood. At one of our first community roundtables, I watched her talk about how she once thought losing control of her money was her own failure, how she didn't even have the words for what was happening to her until someone gave it a name. Financial abuse, she told the room. It sounds so clinical, but let me be clear. It starved me. It broke me. It made me question my worth as a mother. And no one saw it coming. Not my friends, not my family, not even my ex-husband, who paid the bills without ever asking if I was okay. She looked across the room straight at me. I didn't flinch. Because she was right. And I'd spend the rest of my life making sure no one else had to walk through that same darkness alone. Lily, too, had found her way forward. Her art therapy sessions, something we'd added as part of her trauma recovery plan, had blossomed into something much bigger. She'd started drawing not just to process what she'd endured, but to teach. Her therapist, Dr. Emily Chen, suggested we frame her drawings and hang them in our office lobby. So we did. And something extraordinary happened. Survivors walking in for the first time would stop in front of those pictures. Crayon illustrations of stormy houses, shadowy figures, but always with a beam of light peeking through a window or a hand reaching out. And they would cry. They'd point and say, "That's how it felt." Not with words, but with color, with shape, with story. Lily's Lightkeepers, we started calling them. And soon it became a movement inside the movement. We invited other kids who had endured abusive home environments to submit their own drawings, guided by art therapists and trauma counselors. Some of the pictures were raw, gripping, painful. Others were bright, almost startling in their hopefulness. One boy, just 6, drew a picture of a ladder reaching from a dark pit to a cloud labeled safe. I framed that one myself. As the foundation expanded, so did our vision. We launched a school program, financial literacy for children and teens, that taught them not only how to budget or save, but how to recognize coercion and unhealthy financial dynamics. We trained teachers and counselors. We developed screening protocols for pediatricians, attorneys, even bank managers. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were preventing. One afternoon, as I reviewed a grant proposal in my home office, Lily came in carrying her sketchpad. "Can I show you something?" she asked. "Always," I said, setting my laptop aside. She opened the sketchpad to a new drawing. This one was different. Instead of a house or a single figure, it was a big open field under a sunrise. Dozens of small people walked in the same direction, each carrying a tiny glowing object: lanterns, flashlights, candles. In the center, a larger figure stood on a hill, holding a huge torch. "What's this one called?" I asked. "It's called We Walk Each Other Home," she said shyly. I stared at it for a long time. "And who's that in the middle?" She smiled. "Everyone who goes first. Like Mommy, like Jessica, like Ms. Martinez, like you." I pulled her into a hug so tight I worried I might break something. But she just held on, her arms wrapping around me with a warmth that made the past feel survivable. That night, as Caroline and I sat at the dinner table with Lily between us, coloring quietly, we talked about the future, not in the way divorced couples usually do, but as co-founders, as co-parents, as co-survivors of the same storm, finally stepping into the light. "I've been thinking," Caroline said, her voice soft but firm. "I want to speak at the national conference in Chicago next month, about the foundation, about our story." My heart stopped for a moment. "Are you ready?" She didn't hesitate. "I am, and I want to bring Lily with me, if she's okay with it." Lily looked up. "Can I show my drawings too?" We both laughed, and then somehow we were crying, because it had taken so long to get here, because we were finally here. The next morning we held a meeting with the Foundation's board. It included survivors, psychologists, financial experts, and advocates from across the country. We introduced our next phase, a national database for reported financial abusers, a secure anonymous reporting system, an early intervention toolkit for first responders, and a peer mentorship network for children affected by coercive households. "We're not just helping people escape," I said to the room. "We're teaching them how to rebuild, how to lead, how to shine." Across the table, Caroline nodded, then stood. And for the first time she addressed them all, not as a victim, not as a cautionary tale, but as a leader. "My name is Caroline Walsh," she said, "and I once thought asking for help made me weak. But I've learned something from this work, from this team, and most of all from my daughter. Real strength isn't pretending you're fine. It's lighting a path so others can find their way too." The room stood in applause. Lily beamed beside her. And in that moment, I understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't about buildings named after you or headlines in business journals. It was about someone else standing on a stage one day, whispering, "Because of them, I never gave up." The conference hall in downtown Chicago was larger than any room Caroline had spoken in before. A sweeping space, filled wall to wall with advocates, survivors, policymakers, and journalists, all gathered for the National Summit on Domestic Abuse Prevention. The ceiling lights dimmed to a soft golden hue, and the stage was framed by towering digital panels that displayed the Walsh Foundation's logo beside the words "From Control to Courage, Redefining Financial Safety." Backstage, Caroline stood near the curtain with Lily holding her hand tightly. I could see her nerves, small movements, fingers adjusting the cuff of her blazer, her lips repeating silent lines she'd rehearsed the night before. But her eyes were steady. There was a calmness that came not from confidence, but from purpose. "You're going to be amazing," Lily said, her voice like a bell in the hush of the hallway. Caroline looked down and smiled, brushing a hand through her daughter's hair. "You'll be watching?" "Front row," I said from beside them. "Right where I always am." She gave me a look, quietly grateful, layered with everything we'd been through. There was no need for more words. The lights shifted, the moderator called her name, and Caroline stepped out onto the stage. She didn't read from notes. She didn't pace. She simply stood behind the podium, hands gently resting on the edge, and began. "I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd speak about the worst year of my life in front of hundreds of strangers. But I've learned something in the past year. Silence is not safety, and shame is not strength." The room stilled. I was a mother. I was a professional. I was, by every visible metric, doing okay. But behind closed doors, my world was unraveling. Not through fists, not through bruises, but through control. Subtle, relentless, invisible control. My bank account, my passwords, my prescriptions, my sense of reality. She paused. His name was Derek Malone. He told me he'd help me manage my finances after my divorce. He said I was too emotional, too fragile, too distracted, and I believed him. Because when someone tells you that your survival depends on them, over and over, eventually you stop trusting yourself. The panels behind her lit up with muted photos of Lily's drawings, images of small houses, shadowy corners, and glowing lights in windows. "I had support payments from my ex-husband, Greg," she continued, "and they were generous. But I never saw that money. It passed through my hands like smoke. Derek used it to build control while I fell deeper into doubt and isolation, until one day I collapsed, and my daughter had to make the call that saved us." There was a collective intake of breath from the audience. Lily was 8, and she had more courage than I did. The photos on the screen shifted, now showing pictures of Lily's Lightkeeper project, community art sessions, peer-led therapy groups for children. The audience followed every word, some nodding, others wiping away quiet tears. "Financial abuse doesn't leave bruises," Caroline said, "but it breaks you just the same. It steals your dignity. It convinces you that you're incapable of freedom, that you'll never be able to care for your child without someone else's permission." She looked down for a moment. When she raised her head again, her voice was stronger. But it was a lie, a carefully constructed lie, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I chose to fight back, and I wasn't alone. I saw heads turn toward me in the front row, but Caroline kept her focus forward. My daughter's father didn't just write checks, he stayed. He built, he listened. And together we started a foundation that now helps hundreds of women and children who've endured the same invisible war. Applause erupted, but she held up a hand to pause it. "This isn't about our family. This is about yours. Because I promise you, someone in your community, maybe even someone in this room, is in the middle of the storm I survived, and they don't know they're allowed to ask for help." She stepped back from the podium, and the screen faded to white. The crowd rose to their feet. not the polite standing ovation of a well-rehearsed keynote. This was something else, raw, real, a wave of gratitude, respect, and shared understanding. Lily ran to her as she stepped off stage, wrapping her arms around Caroline's waist. The two of them stood there, cocooned in applause, before disappearing into the embrace of dozens of women waiting backstage to thank her. Many of them were strangers, but not really. They knew her pain. They recognized her journey. They saw themselves in her strength. Later that evening, the three of us sat on the rooftop terrace of the hotel, watching the city lights blink into the dusk. Lily was curled up in a patio chair, sketch pad in her lap, headphones in. Caroline sipped from a cup of tea, her posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. "You did something powerful today," I said. She smiled, but her expression was more thoughtful than triumphant. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I still am." "That's what made it matter," I said. "It wasn't polished. It was real." She looked over at me, her voice lower. "Do you ever wonder how many times we passed someone like Derek in the grocery store or in Lily's school parking lot and just never saw it?" "All the time," I replied. "But not anymore. We see it now, and we're teaching others to see it too." The door behind us opened, and one of the organizers stepped out holding her phone. "Caroline," she said, "CNN wants to do a feature on the foundation. They saw the keynote." Caroline looked stunned. "Really?" The woman nodded. "They said it's the most compelling survivor story they've heard in years. They want to talk to you, Greg, and they want to interview Lily too. If she's willing." Lily, suddenly alert, took one earbud out. "Can I show them my drawings?" We all laughed. It was the first pure sound of joy in a long time. After the organizer left, Caroline reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "I never thought this would be our life again," she said. I looked around, at Lily, at the lights, at the quiet warmth between us, and said, "It's not our old life. It's something better. We've earned every part of it." That night, I lay awake thinking not of the trauma or the courtrooms, but of the ripple effect. Of the teacher in Ohio who emailed us last week, saying she'd recognized signs of financial abuse in one of her students' parents after reading about our work. Of the retired banker in Florida who volunteered to teach financial literacy at a shelter. Of the thousands of small lights we'd helped ignite, people passing on what they'd learned, like torches in the dark. And I thought about Lily's drawing that morning before the conference. A field of tiny lanterns, all walking in the same direction. We were just getting started, and the light was only beginning to spread. The morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of our newly opened Walsh Foundation Community Center, casting golden streaks across the lobby floor. It was our first Saturday with the entire team under one roof. Advocates, therapists, survivors, financial mentors, and a group of volunteers who had once been on the receiving end of our services. There was laughter in the halls, children's artwork on the walls, and the smell of fresh muffins wafting from the kitchen, where a mother who used to live in a shelter now ran a weekend breakfast club. I stood by the front door with a coffee in hand, watching it all unfold. It felt less like an office and more like a neighborhood gathering place, a living symbol of how far we had come. Caroline walked up beside me, her heels quiet on the polished wood floors. She wore a navy blue suit jacket with a soft floral blouse underneath and carried a file of new proposals under her arm. "I just got off the phone with the Department of Education," she said with a proud little smile. "They want to pilot our Lightkeeper curriculum in 2 more states, starting next semester." I exhaled, shaking my head in disbelief. From art therapy in Lily's bedroom to nationwide programming, it's happening faster than I ever imagined. "It's because people are hungry for solutions," she said. "They're tired of pretending this kind of abuse doesn't exist. They want tools, they want hope." We stepped into the main activity room, where Lily and her friends were seated at their usual long art table. Each of them had been through something dark: divorce, shelters, poverty, emotional neglect, but now they wore colorful smocks and held markers like swords. They were drawing light maps, part of an ongoing art series where they helped new kids express their feelings through symbols, shapes, and small gestures of creativity. Lily spotted us and waved. I smiled back, and Caroline's hand brushed lightly against mine. "Did you see her newest piece?" she asked. She's calling it lantern carriers. It's about how every person who's healed becomes a light for someone still in the dark. I nodded. It's the most important work I've ever been a part of. In the afternoon, we held our first community storytelling session. The center's multipurpose room was filled with folding chairs arranged in a circle, pitchers of lemonade on side tables, and soft music playing from a corner speaker. One by one, women and a few men stood up to tell their stories. Not to vent, not to relive trauma, but to own it, reclaim it, transform it. Margaret Wellington, now a mentor and speaker in our program, was among the first to speak. My son was Derek Malone, she said plainly with no theatrics. And for most of my life, I thought love meant obedience. That survival meant silence. I passed those beliefs down, and they destroyed people. She paused, letting the room breathe. But I'm here now, because it's never too late to learn, or to unlearn. And if I can help one parent see what I didn't, then maybe all this pain can mean something. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later that evening, after the storytelling session ended, Lily and I sat in the courtyard behind the center. She had her sketch pad open again, her feet swinging above the patio bricks. "Do you think we'll ever be all done?" she asked suddenly. "All done with what?" "Helping, building, talking about it." I thought for a moment. "No," I said finally, "but I think that's a good thing." She seemed to consider this, then nodded and returned to her drawing. Just before sundown, we hosted a community dinner under string lights in the back garden. Families arrived carrying casseroles, pasta, bread, and pie. Children chased each other around the picnic tables. The air was filled with laughter and soft jazz playing from someone's portable speaker. Caroline stood at the head of the long table and raised her glass. "I used to think healing was a destination," she said, her voice clear and warm. "But I've learned it's more like a journey, one you walk beside people who understand, even when they don't say a word." This foundation started with one phone call, made by a frightened little girl under a bed. Now, it's a community. A network of light, and we're just getting started. The crowd cheered, and Lily squeezed her hand tightly. After dinner, we walked together as a family, just a short loop around the block. Caroline took Lily's hand, and I walked on her other side. We didn't speak much. We didn't have to. The quiet said everything. When we returned to the center, a teenage girl stood at the front door holding a folded pamphlet. She looked uncertain, her eyes darting between us and the building. Her clothes were wrinkled, and her backpack looked too heavy for her frame. "Are you?" she started, but her voice cracked. Caroline stepped forward gently. "Hi, sweetheart. You're safe here? Would you like to come in?" The girl nodded slowly. Lily walked forward, holding a fresh drawing in her hand. "Here," she said. "You can sit with me. We're doing light maps." The girl's eyes filled with tears. She followed Lily inside, and the door closed behind them. Caroline turned to me, eyes shining. "That right there," she said. "That's why we do this." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was full. Weeks passed, and the foundation grew. National press picked up our story. Schools began requesting training kits, and churches and libraries asked to host Lightkeeper exhibits. Caroline was invited to join a congressional roundtable on financial abuse legislation. Lily's artwork was featured in a children's mental health magazine. And I became something I never expected. A teacher. A father not just to Lily, but to a generation of other kids learning that asking for help is a sign of strength, not shame. Our Sundays became sacred, a time not for meetings or media or events, but for each other. Walks in the park, board games, ice cream, stories on the couch. One Sunday, as we watched Lily sketch in the sunshine, Caroline leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I feel like we're finally living again." And I realized she was right. Not surviving, living. We hadn't just rebuilt a family, we'd rebuilt a future. One that sparkled like sunlight through the leaves, one that hummed with laughter, creativity, and the steady beat of hearts finally at peace. And in the quiet of that moment, watching Lily add golden light to yet another drawing, I knew there would always be more work to do, more people to help, more stories to hear. But for now, we had each other. And we had the light. And that was enough. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this powerful journey. If you've made it here, it means the story touched something deep inside you, and we're truly grateful for your presence. This story reminds us that true strength isn't about wealth or control. It's about listening, showing up, and choosing love when it's hardest. It teaches us that healing is possible, not just for individuals, but for entire families and communities, when we choose compassion over judgment and courage over silence. Maybe you saw a part of yourself in Greg, in Caroline, or even in young Lily. Maybe someone you know is still struggling in the dark. Let this story be a reminder. There's always light to be found, and you can be the one who helps someone else find it. Where are you tuning in from today? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story of hope, healing, and human resilience. Together, let's keep the light going.